just beginning to work on is going to be a book about the notion of post-black drama. And what post-black is a phrase coined by the Studio Theater's curator, Thelma Golden. And what she argues is that in this contemporary time period, as we move beyond some of the exigencies and concerns that were past, that we move to a different place of where we can think about race and blackness. So the sense of being post, so many things, post-black is a place of being beyond that. But then she makes an interesting point. It's being beyond, but also being conscious of. You know, so it's not saying I'm away from being black. She describes post-black as the new black, as a new way of understanding the contemporary context. So I'm going to look at a number of plays, contemporary plays that fall into that. And the sort of demarcation of where this occurs is with the election of Barack Obama. And the why of that I'm going to talk about here. And I'm going to give you another title in terms of what I'm going to talk about more specifically. I'm going to talk about this notion of what is a black play. And if we think about that, I want to think about it ethically, as this is Ethics at Noon. And I'm going to talk about it in 4 distinct examples. And within those case studies, I'll raise some questions that we can talk about afterwards. I'll also make some sort of claims within each of them. So I'm going to raise some ethical questions and also claims in each of those 4 different sections as I go. Before that, I want to lay out some ideas of thinking about this question of what is a black play. And invariably, ever since there was drama, people have asked, what is a play? And over time, that definition keeps changing. So within that category is this sense of what is a black play within it, and I'm talking now specifically within American context, looking first the existence of African Americans in America. And an interesting document was written, or a significant document was written in 1926. And this was the recipe for a Negro theater by W.E.B. Du Bois. And in it, his claim was that Negro theater need to be for us, by us, and about us. Okay, so within that, the sense of for, potentially being about and for specifically a black audience, by, written by a black audience, or black playwrights, excuse me, about, dealing with in some ways the black experience in America, and near the sense of being located in the community. So how is that definition potentially morphed over time? Where it raises certain ethical questions that these plays are going to consider. You know, what happens if a play is written by a black author like Lorraine Hansberry's, who wrote Raisin in the Sun? Yes, people know Lorraine Hansberry, Raisin in the Sun. Well, her next play after that was A Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window. And it only had one black character and focused on Sidney Brewstein, a Jewish character. So can a black play be written by a black author about not black things? As one part of the question. Or the plays that I'm going to talk about today specifically are plays that feature black casts, deal with potentially black subject matter about, but are written by non-black authors. So what does that do in this contemporary? Where does this definition go? How do we understand that definition within our contemporary space? Now, before I get into those 4 sections, I wanted to lay out this question of what is a black play in a way. I did a special issue of the leading journal in our field, a journal called Theater Journal. And I did in it, this was 2005, and I had a number of people. I asked that question, what is a black play or what is black performance? And people answered it differently. But one of the people I asked to answer it is Suzanne Laurie Parks, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, a play called Top Dog, Underdog, MacArthur Award winner, wrote a book called Getting Mother's Body that's a riff on Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. Anyway, so Suzanne is a very interesting person, to say the least. And this is what she wrote. I'm just going to give you a segment of what she wrote in terms of thinking about what is a black play. Okay, and you'll see how she goes off on this. What is a black play? A black play is angry. A black play is fierce. A black play is double voiced but really confused. A black play got style. A black play is of the people, by the people, and for the people. A black play is smooth but not slick, heavy but not thick, can't be tamed, often does not comb its hair, wipes its mouth in the back of its hand or with a linen napkin, whichever is more readily available. A black play is late. A black play is right on and right on time. A black play is deep. A black play is armed to the teeth. A black play bows to God, then rows the boat ashore. A black play makes do if it's got to, fights, screams, sings, dreams, works it, talks in code and tells it like it is, all up in your face. A black play gives you 5. A black play is robust and alive. A black play is in the house and looking good too. A black play is a bad motherfucker. A black play does not exist. Every play is a black play. Say what? A black play is a white play when the lights go out. A black play is a white play when you read between the lines. A black play got its picture on the wall in the local post office. A black play got its butt on death row for a crime it perhaps did not commit. A black play got its black butt in the White House, seated at the right hand of the man. A black play keeps you up at night. A black play is awake. A black play gonna kick your ass. A black play has genitals that people think about long after the curtain comes down. A black play is running for president. A black play gotta get out the vote. A black play is a leader, but seldom an elected official. A black play, as a child, wonder why if Jesse Owens won all them gold medals, then how come a black man couldn't beat a white man in a presidential race? Well, this was 2005. A black play is in the streets. A black play ain't no Negro. A black play is buck wild. A black play is mixed. A black play is on Broadway, the great white way. A black play is not on Broadway, and furthermore, ain't studying no Broadway. A black play is coming soon to a theater near you. A black play got a fro. A black play know the no. A black play go toe to toe all the way out the dough. A black play gonna burn the MF down Monday, Friday, and twice on the weekends. A black play is chronic. A black play takes into account the pollsters that found that black folks don't attend the theater in numbers large enough to influence the selections of plays produced. A black play is very intellectual. A black play is studied, conducts discourse, and on certain days of the week can be found living in the big house of tradition. A black play got a mission. A black play dreams the impossible dream. A black play is such things as dreams are made on. A black play was the first black play ever written and will be the last black play standing. A black play takes shape just outside the reaches of your white understanding, no matter what your color, baby. A black play ain't for you. A black play ain't about you. A black play ain't integrated and don't want to be. A black play ain't playing. A black play knows that when audiences read it primarily through the rubric of race relations, that those audiences are suffering from an acute attack of white narcissism. If you have a need to see yourself reflected in things that are not directly about you, then you are the one afflicted. A black play don't give a shit about what you think. A black play knows all about the black hole and the great hole of history and ain't afraid of going there. A black play sometimes put its foot in its mouth, but hell, a black play sometimes gets its mouth to feed and shoe leather tastes like chicken when you're hungry. A black play wants to know where Harriet Tubman at. A black play fights the power. A black play wants to uplift the race. A black play just might set the race back 10 years. A black play is not political. That term don't even begin to approach its complexity, especially these days, dog. A black play knows how to play the game. A black play is. And that was just part of it, but I figured you'd get the flavor of where she was going with that. So within that, that's the idea of this black play. You see, I mean, there's no simple definition. It's this confusing contextual thing, you know, and so what it means today is something that I want to think about and think about as I talk with you, and point and claim that I want to make at the beginning. I think the cultural context has a lot to do with how we're operating, how we think about and you know, who has a control of the idea of what it means to be black, who controls blackness, or how it's represented. Okay, so the representation of blackness, in particular, right now I'm talking stage. Did anyone see the movie Bamboozled? Has anybody seen that movie Bamboozled? If you haven't seen, see it. It's a very, very interesting film by Spike Lee that deals, among other things, with blackface in media and this question of who controls black representation. And in that, there's this character who's a white woman who's a PhD in Afro-American Studies at Yale, and she comes to help the situation. And in talking about it, the lead protagonist character calls her a negrologist. But her point in this, she asks that question of who controls, or what does it mean to, or shouldn't anybody? I mean, why does one black voice have to speak for all of them? Shouldn't you be able to have your own voice, or shouldn't others be able to look at the situation, given our context now? So those are some of the ethical questions I think that we'll bring up. Now I said there's 4 distinct sections, and I'm going to deal with it with a play and the notion of directing a play by August Wilson in 2009. Bartlett Sher, a white director, famous director from up in Seattle, who most recently before he directed this play had done a wonderful version of South Pacific, directed black playwright August Wilson's, what he feels is his most significant play, Joe Turner's Come and Gone on Broadway. So I'm going to deal with that. That was 2009. It opened in April, but I'm going to talk about an event that happened in June 2009 in relationship to that play. From there, going to move into talking about the play Race by David Mamet, white playwright David Mamet, most famous for American Buffalo, perhaps, in Glengarry Glen Ross, also for a variety of movies. And Mamet's play also came to Broadway in 2009. And more than the play, going to talk about an article he wrote anticipating the coming of the play. From there, going to talk about a critically off-Broadway play written by a Korean-American playwright, Young Jean Kim, about African-American experience called The Shipment. And that also was 2009. And finally, I'm going to deal with a musical. And the musical, The Scottsboro Boys, and The Scottsboro Boys with music by John Kander and Fred Ebb, and book by David Thompson, and directed by Susan Stroman. These are some of the most well-known teams. Fred Ebb recently died, but one of the most well-known musical teams in terms of American theater today. The writers did the musical Chicago, for example, and Susan Stroman is an incredible choreographer and director. I think she's won a couple of Tony Awards. So they did this musical on The Scottsboro Boys, and I'll talk about that to end. And with each one, I'll set up the sort of themes of it and talk about the claims within each. The major question that I want to think about in relationship to this is a sense of why now, at this moment in time, do we have this influx, in a sense, of plays about black experience written by non-black playwrights? Why now is that happening? Or what is it about now that's made that true? Because, in fact, it hadn't happened. There's another play that I'm not going to talk about that recently came, written by a non-black player. This is Free Man of Color, written by John Guare, and was off Broadway at Lincoln Center, featuring Mos Def and the amazing Jeffrey Wright in it. And I'm not going to talk about it because it sucked, actually. I went there with my wife, and I was determined to leave at, despite the cost, to leave at intermission. And she says, but I feel so bad for the actors. We should stay for them. And I'm thinking, I feel bad for me. I'm ready to go. So anyway, we'll not talk about that. So in terms of this question of why non-black play and why now, I mentioned Du Bois, and I want to go back and look historically for 1 second. Du Bois, I said, was 1926. Well, in that period of the 1920s, this was the other time that we saw this occur in terms of the variety of plays written about black experience by non-black playwrights. So there was a play In Abraham's Bosom, Porgy, that became the musical Porgy and Bess, Green Pastures, about a black heaven where the Lord, spelled D-E-L-A-W-D, has fish fries for his angels, and Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones as well. So this period, and what I would say was true, is a notion that what George Fredrickson, who used to teach here, the late George Fredrickson, called romantic racialism. So there was a romantic ideal about the black person as primitive, as noble savage, and that's what's featured within these plays. And these authors felt they had the right, in a sense, to talk about this experience. Okay, so it was their right at that time. So you can think about the context informed the image of blackness that was portrayed, and also the legitimacy of white playwrights writing about it in terms of that. So context is important. All right, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, and the politics of directing a black play. So I said I was going to talk about it not when Bartlett Sher, the white director, opened the play in April, but I'll talk about it in June 2009. And does anybody know what happened in June 2009 with this play? Anybody know? I'm calling it a watershed moment in terms of this idea, in terms of black theater, in terms of setting up this catalytic moment. Barack Obama and his wife Michelle went to see the play, and they went, on a date. That was national news. Changed. I mean, the play was a hit. But more than that, when the President of the United States comes, all of a sudden it's even more of a thing. Okay, so we could argue that in doing that, he gave sanction to the play, or at least this production of the play. Okay, and when we think about that, it's important. I mean, one, he was the first black president, but two, he was a black president that even around his own sense of race, there's been some contestation, that he's of mixed heritage, which is interesting with a black father and a white mother, and August Wilson. But he claims, as we know on the census and everything, he claims himself as black. Interesting, August Wilson, a playwright who also claims himself as black. His mother was black, his father was white as well. So an interesting relationship between the two. But when we think about the election and we think about the aftermath of that election, the claim that were made that we live in a potentially post-race moment, right? That race doesn't matter anymore in America. We have a black president, everything's solved. So that context of thinking, of liberal thinking that makes it potentially possible for different things to happen, or in terms of, or different thinking about race. Potentially Barack Obama, and his coming to the play, we can see that as saying, this is a different time. This is a different moment. So that's one of the questions I'm asking. What is the significance? And I think when I write this, the book on this, I'm going to start with this incident as that sense of catalytic moment, thinking about what happens when the president comes, or that it reveals a sense in his generation time and some different thinking about, or the capacity to think about race differently than had happened before. Okay, marking that point. Now, significantly about this play and why this play is that August Wilson, prior to this, and he had passed away by the time he passed away in 2005. August Wilson, prior to his most famous play, or one of his most famous, his play, Fences, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1987, was supposed to go on, be made into a film. And they were thinking of having a white director direct the film, but he famously said, "I want a black director," and wrote an article on it and claimed that I need somebody who can deal with the sense of cultural specificity and knowledge of the culture and be attuned to that. So it was a pretty political statement and claim for him to make. So we've got that claim, and we've got Bartlett Sher directing it. Then let's add to that. But I mean, Wilson is interesting on that, and we can, if you have questions on that later, we can touch on that. And but the major thing that I'd say about Wilson, in terms of that idea, is that his last play that I saw him in, where he was doing himself, he made a point of saying it was directed by a white director, and direct at the end of it. It was his one-man show, came down and shook his hand. And also, he did a version of Fences. He let actually a Stanford student, Meg Booker, was eventually my PhD student years before she came to Stanford, directed a production of Fences, white director directed a production of Fences in Beijing, China, with the Chinese cast. So it's a complicated there, but nonetheless, he wrote that. Now, the critics, in response to the arrivals, this is the New York Times, the most rave review you could imagine. The revival of August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone, a drama of indisputable greatness, feels positively airborne. Much of Bartlett Sher's splendid production, which opened Thursday night at the Belasco Theater, moves with the engaging ease of lively, casual conversation. That's the scale of Joe Turner, too. It is magically larger than life and exactly precisely life-size. So is Mr. Sher's interpretation, which seems to take place in both a well-scrubbed, modest sitting room and a fairy tale forest. So that was some of the review, and the reviews pretty much across the board were that type of rate. So we've got this idea that they're saying that this production is better than all the others. August Wilson, who said that he wants a black director, the president coming to it, sanctioning it. So the first claim that I'm making remains to what relates to what I said earlier, and that's the notion that the context is really important to how we think about this definition of what is a black play, or who can do what with black theater. Okay, so this context that we see with Barack Obama, this context at the Times created potentially a different possibility. Now, interestingly, to that point, Sher himself felt that having but that Barack Obama had an impact on him even directing the play. Every show I do has to speak to the times, he says. The final is bloody and wrenching, but somehow hopeful, with the characters stepping out of the darkness of slavery and into an unknown future filled with danger, but at least the possibility of something better. After 8 years of Bush, that's where Scheer sees America, shaking off a terrible period and facing east. So he links himself, so there's an interesting sense of context, again, in how he's seeing himself within it. And again, thinking about what Scheer says, and this is one of the ethical questions I want to ask, is that if August Wilson is not simply a great black playwright, but one of the greatest American playwrights, I mean, he has a theater named after him in New York, now the August Wilson Theater, where this play, or no August Wilson play is played at the August Wilson Theater. Jersey Boys has been running there basically since it opened, and it's been a hit. But I mean, if he is a great American playwright, then shouldn't a great director like Bartlett Sher have the right to direct it? So that's the ethical question. I mean, what's to say that Bartlett Sher couldn't direct it? I mean, and let's look at the reverse as another ethical question. So does that mean that a person of color couldn't direct Arthur Miller or couldn't direct Shakespeare? You know, so that's the first example and questions that we have, the claim that context matters, and those ethical questions. It turned now to David Mamet's Race and the Social Context for his play. And his play opened in the summer of 2009 as well. And in September of 2009, he wrote an article in the New York Times anticipating it. And he saw his play called Race as an answer to the national dialogue on race that Obama had called for. So if you remember Obama calling for, after all the incidents that happened, and doing that speech on race, calling for a national dialogue. So Mamet felt his play was an answer to that. And more than that, he felt that America for years has been having a difficult dialogue on race. And so he wanted to enter into that with this play. And then he made some interesting claims in the article. And I'm going to read off some of those, and this is him. As a Jew, I will relate that there is nothing a non-Jew can say to a Jew on the subject of Jewishness that is not patronizing, upsetting, or simply wrong. I assume the same holds true for African Americans. So it's an interesting thing to put his racial identity up there as a sense of legitimizing his way into writing about or thinking about these subjects. So that's one question. I'll return to it later with the Shipment, is how does someone else's racial identity, is there affinity as Jewish and Jewish suffering? Does that give someone a different sort of license to write about race, and in particular African-American experience? So one's cultural tradition or identity. Then what he's arguing within it is both within the article and then later the play, is that there's a discomfort with talking about race. Okay, and then he goes on to say, race, like sex, is a subject on which it is near impossible to tell the truth. In each desire, self-interest and self-image make the truth inconvenient to share not only with strangers, who may legitimately or not be viewed as opponents, but also with members of one's own group and indeed oneself. For just as personal advantage is derived by whites from the defense of slavery and its continuation as Jim Crow and segregation, so too, personal advantage, political advantage, and indeed expression of deeply held belief may lead non-whites to defend positions that, though they may be momentarily acceptable, will eventually be revealed as untenable. Okay, so here he makes the claim and is relating the idea of how African Americans or other people of color may take political advantage, and you can think of a lot of the context in and around that is not that different from the defense of slavery and the continuation of Jim Crow. Now, to me, what this supposes is an equality within this situation, of race, right? I mean, that they're equal parts and players. And he carries this further, because what he goes into then is he talks about race as a marriage, and we can think about partners in a marriage, or partners potentially even coming there by choice. And if we think about slavery, it wasn't about choice, right? So I don't think there's a dynamic he's conscious of. But he goes on to say this: we are bound to each other, as are all Americans, bound though subdivided not only by race, but by religion, politics, age, region, and culture. We not only seem to be, but are working it out. Contemporary considerations of diversity, multiculturalism, affirmative action, reparations, and so on, I believe, the beginning of the final wave of the exceptionalism of the Black American experience. These difficult, divisive questions like those of abortion, gun control, gay rights, and illegal immigration are and will continue to be adjudicated in the legislatures, the courts, and the public consensus until the dialogue is done. When will it be over? It will be over, like a marital fight at an unforeseeable time when it has run its natural course. Okay, so he sees the notion that, and there's a number of books that it pronounces, even one called The End of Race by Deborah Dickinson, that's been out in this period. So he sees this eventual end of this importance of these. So here's my claim in relationship to him, and we can talk about what he said. But what I think he's not conscious of, so the claim I wanted to make is that he's not conscious of history. So as we moved into this contemporary moment and saying that things are different and we look at race now, what often happens is we look away from race then, okay, and that history that in fact has shaped things. So that's what I mean by this unequal relationship in terms of the dynamic that shaped white-black relationships in this country. So without that, so that sense of marriage isn't looking at that interaction. Okay, so that's my claim. The question still within that is one, again, the question of context is still there. And the question, in a sense of, with history, why drag that history into this? I mean, if the history is past, if it's past, let it go. One of the things his play asked is that sense of the discomfort comes in a sense of that history and people feeling guilty. Why bring that in? So that's a question there. All right, going to leave that. I'm not even. If you want to know what the play's about, really quickly, it's a play about there's a white law firm defending a white client who is accused of raping a black woman. So it's interesting in his thing that he wrote before the article. He talks about marriage and he talks about sex, and here he goes beyond sex to rape, which is a power dynamic. And what I'm suggesting to you is there's a power dynamic at play in terms of the interplay of black and white in terms of the history of race. Okay, next play, The Shipment and Identity Politics. And this is an interesting play by Young Jean Kim, a Korean playwright. And within it, she writes what she calls a black identity politics show. And she wrote this, and what she does is she explores and both lampoons African-American culture in ways and stereotypes. And before this, she wrote a play doing the same thing about Christian churches and about Asian Americans. Okay? So you can say that this is a line of her previous work. So if she's done it before, the ethical question, why can't she do it now? If she did it about other people, if she did it, she's Asian American, she did it about Asian Americans, why can't she do it about African Americans? Again, that sense of cultural closeness or proximity. I mean, can a person of color, who potentially has more a relationship, knowledge, awareness, whatever, are they more able to write about African American experience because of their affinity? Well, the play is interesting in the sense that it mixes humor at the beginning. You would love this, Matthew, if you haven't seen it, is a stand-up comedy routine. He writes about narrations and stand-up comedy. Within that, it plays off certain stereotypes, and one of those, the sort of the foul-mouthed black comic, and where its places within our society. It also plays off a character who wants to be a rapper and what happens to him. So it plays off these stereotypes that we know well and somewhat subverts them within the action of it. And in so doing, raises questions about those images. And what does it mean, in a sense, that we've seen these images proliferate? In the sense that blackness has become a commodity. Right? It's been used on TV to sell everything from hamburgers to cars, whatever, to those images we all know well. They're sort of infused in our mind, from the rapper to, and it's interesting how there's a double side to that, right? That's both potentially dangerous, but both enticing. Somebody like 50 Cent, scary looking guy in some ways, but is a hit, a success, popular. So the commodification of blackness. So here's the question in terms of the commodification of blackness, and that's my claim, that blackness has become increasingly commodified, and within this play, we see this is a condition that Young Jean Kim is looking at. But the question with that, if blackness is in fact a commodity, why shouldn't anybody be able to sell it, use it, speak to it, write about it? So Why, I mean, should young Jean Kim be doing it be different in a sense than anybody else doing it, and have access to that? And again, the question I asked before, what about her ethnic position? Does that give her a particular agency to write about African American experience? Last play, The Scottsboro Boys and the Politics of Irreverence. Anybody know the story of the Scottsboro Boys? Yes, no? Yeah. Tell me, Justin.
Accusation of rape on the train.
Yeah. So this group of black men in 1931 were accused of raping a white woman in Alabama on a train. And it became a sensational trial that went on for years. And when you think about that, that's not usually a subject for a musical, right? Where people are going to sing and dance. And so that's the matter of, the question, and actually let me ask this up front then, with that, is that it's a question of genre. And what genre can you do certain things in? And this is the politics of reverence. Should certain things be treated in certain ways? So for example, something that both Renu and Matthew know, we teach in our IHOM, and Rachel had to read it. We teach in our IHOM Mouse, the Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel about the Holocaust. But some people said you can't write about that horror in terms of a graphic novel. Or you can't deal with the Holocaust in terms of comedy. But you have, somebody like Mel, what's his last name?
Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah, dealing with it very effectively comically. Or in terms of slavery, same thing. There's a play called Holding History by a young black playwright, Robert O'Hara. I guess he's not young anymore, but Robert O'Hara in this thinks about the gay presence in slavery. And within that, he goes back in terms of slavery, and he treats it sort of in camp. He has the revolutionary activist Nat Turner doing the hokey pokey, for example. And he has these slaves that are picking, excuse me, I saw a production of it in San Francisco. The director, there's a scene where the slaves are picking cotton, and he had them pick cotton in these, instead of burlap sacks to put the cotton in, they had bags like the Saks Fifth Avenue bag, or they had like the brown bag you get at Bloomingdale's, sort of to play off the camp, and to ask the question, who holds history? Well, this one cast member, she couldn't take that. She didn't like the idea that slavery was been treated with that irreverence. She would sneak her own little burlap sack onto the stage with every performance. So she put her, and I went to see it, one of the times I went to see it with a woman from England who's a head of sort of black theater and has written about black theater there. And she felt very uncomfortable with the treatment of slavery. So are there certain subjects, question, are there certain subjects that you can only treat in certain ways? Okay? What sort of respect do you have to have potentially for a certain subject? So that's a question in a sense of genre. And it's also a question, an interesting question of the relationship of content and form. And how should, in effect, content or form be the inner logic in a sense of content? What should be their relationship as a question? So in this play, also, the play follows structurally the form of a minstrel show. So there's only one white character who's the interlocutor, and the rest of the figures are black figures. So if you know anything about minstrelsy and the minstrel show, it's an original sort of American form of dramaturgy. Okay, this form of the minstrel show, but within it, in a sense, what it did was reinforce certain stereotypes about blackness over time and repeatedly. And one of the things it used was blackface. And this play uses black characters in blackface. Okay, so here's another question. You've got all of the history that went into that, blacks in black plays, the stereotypes that came out of minstrelsy. And this is a play that's trying to use all that, in a sense, to subvert that and talk about the racism that was used against these black men back in 1931. I mean, is it possible to do that, with the form? Is it too much within that, too much history? I went one time to this workshop on blackface. And within this workshop, what we were supposed to do is we sat opposite somebody else, and we put blackface on our face, and I mean, they would put blackface on our face, and I would put it on theirs, or vice versa, right? You get it. Okay, so I was putting it on this, this white woman who was sitting, and who was opposite me, and just watching her face as I did it. It was like I was putting history on her face and the reaction. And I mean, and it's not just like wearing makeup. I mean, it's not just like wearing makeup because of the history that's gone into that. So how do you do that, in a sense, and at the same time trying to subvert it and give images and refute the racism at the time? And then it's a musical. People sing up and dance. And one of the rousing numbers is supposed to be about getting close to the electric chair. So, so that's an interesting thing to do a song and dance about. So that's the question there. And the sense of irreverence relates also to the context of time that I mentioned now. And the context in terms of the now is that there has been a different sense of irreverence and treatment of history. This guy, Mark Anthony Neal, in his book about post-soul and what he calls the post-soul aesthetic, talks about the sense that being removed from the history, the prior history of African-American experience, that black performers now can look back at that with a sense of irreverence or difference, or saying we see that history differently now. We don't have to hold it in the same way. So this, the example he gives, and I think it's a good example, is Outkast. The group Outkast did this song Rosa Parks, about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks sued them, but nonetheless, that they felt, they have a different relationship to that history. So that gave them the space to think about it differently. So we can think about that as an ethical question too. Does the time now, I've been talking about context, does our remove from now give us a right to look at history differently, to form it differently, and to think about it differently? So we've seen these examples now. We talked about the context in which it happens, and the context of now creating potentially an environment that's more conducive to a different relationship to race and thinking about race. Talked about the sense that the cultural affinity and where does, or the question of, or the claim of what does proximity have. Talked about the fact that we have a different relationship to history, and what does that inform our sense of looking at what constitutes a black play. So all of this, I would say, and this is my final point, and then we have about, I guess, 15 minutes for questions and discussion. And that is that the final point is all of these things relate to that question, claim that I made at the beginning, deal with the sense of culture and who has control in terms of representation of blackness. And this is an idea that was put forward by Stuart Hall in what he called the politics of representation. And the politics of representation are about just that. Who has the power to control images, what we see? And sometimes it's not just about being in front and seeing, it's about who controls the mechanism, is what he argues, of production. So who controls those images that are going out? So I will stop there.